pleasure today to introduce to you Dr. Edward Forsythe, who is the Associate Professor in the History Department of Long Beach State University. Dr. Forsythe is author of the Crisis of Italy, Monetary and Financial Policy 1913 to 1922. He is co-editor of The Origins of National Financial Systems, Alexander Gerstenheim, Reconsidered and Regime Changes, Macroeconomic Policy and Financial Regulation in Europe from the 1930s to the 1990s. Prior to joining the Bowling Green faculty, Dr. Forsythe taught at Princeton University and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. As an affiliate at the Center for European Studies at Harvard University, he co-chaired the Italian Studies Group. This morning, we'll
Thank you for coming out in this time. I think this is probably very well. And I think for myself, by the way, and I was also a little bit jealous of I felt like prior to that. Last spring, I gave a talk on So last spring I gave a talk on the future of NATO in here in this great decision series, and for the first time I find I've involved in this program. I find myself giving a talk on exactly the same topic a year later. And so I put this year's presentation together. I read out the text of that earlier talk, and there's nothing in it that deeply embarrasses me or that it makes the manager second guess extensively now. And there's into two very different scenarios for the future of NATO. The big one, the U.S. presidential election in 2024. On the one hand, I predicted that if Joe Biden won, and keep in mind that last February he was elected Democratic candidate, it might have a bright future, especially in light of the accession of Finland as Sweden to NATO membership, Russia's difficulties prosecuting the Ukraine war, and the success of the United States and its NATO allies in supplying Ukraine. If, on the other hand, Donald Trump won the election and became president in January 2025, I predicted that NATO would fall apart, Russia would win its war in Ukraine, tackling its Taiwan, and the closing of the U.S. nuclear umbrella over Europe and East Asia would trigger the greatest acceleration of nuclear proliferation since the dawn of the nuclear age. Stop right there. Yeah, okay. Somebody told me it was going to be disrupted, and so I thought this was going to be disruption. I heard it likely that a lot of other bad things would also happen, but it's speculated about them was idle since the complexity of events in the real world would quickly become our purpose to be changed. Well, we know who won the election, so fasten your seatbelts. However, before I begin to stop thinking of where things stand at the moment and where they might be headed, some disclaimers are in order. A year ago, I began my talk with the usual disclaimers about the incapacity of historians and other social scientists to predict the future. The point out that while political scientists and economists typically claim some ability to forecast as historians tend to be almost a good deal more hesitant to do so. Indeed, writing a paper with a topic like the future of NATO almost amounts to malpractice for a historian. So let's be clear. It seems to me the present moment is fraught with great uncertainty. It's really bad. We wish to be trying to predict the future. But given the uncertainty, what can we say about what's going to happen to the way of lives? Well, this past July, the Journal of Foreign Affairs asked 46 experts the following question, quote, will the NATO alliance survive in a second term of Donald Trump? Only a small minority of the respondents thought that a formal U.S. withdrawal from the alliance in the hypothetical 4-year second Trump term was likely. However, the majority pointed out that this isn't really a key issue. The key issue is whether or not actors in the international system believe that the alliance will function as stipulated in its charter and policy documents in an emergency. Will, for example, the members implement Article 5, which considers an attack on any member of the alliance to be an attack on all members. The majority of respondents indicated that the credibility of NATO would be at a minimum put into question in a second Trump presidency. Some respondents felt the treaty would become a dead letter, even if it formally remained in effect. I think we all need to be clear about this. No one can say with confidence beginning on the 20th of January 2025 that the United States will honor any longer the obligations that incurred with organized NATO. This is a major change in world affairs, and it will have far-reaching consequences. However, it's not exactly an unanticipated development. Already in the 1950s, policymakers in the United States and Europe anticipated the possibility that the United States might one day off the European affairs. I don't need to remind you of the long tradition of isolationism, American thinking about international relations. Dwight Eisenhower, who was the first Supreme Allied Commander of Europe in 1951-52, and then, of course, later a U.S. president, looked at the sprawling that the United States had assumed in the wake of World War II and felt they were scarcely sustainable. With respect to Europe in particular, he felt it was a profound historical anomaly that former great powers, including Britain and France and Germany, tolerated the long-term garrisoning of American troops on their soil. Presumably, he was not at all surprised when Charles de Gaulle called for the withdrawal of U.S. military forces from French soil in 1966. And he was still alive to experience this, by the way. He lived until 1969. For his part, de Gaulle, who was Prime Minister of France in 1958-59 and the President of the French Republic from 1959 to 1969, doubted that the United States' resolve to maintain forces in Europe and to maintain its commitment to European security would last forever. His famous remark, "Ils ne sont pas sérieux," they're not serious, was about the willingness of the United States to pursue a consistent grand strategy in international politics over the long haul. Konrad Adenauer, the Chancellor of West Germany between 1949 and 1963, similarly doubted the capacity of the United States to sustain a long-term commitment to European security. Bring Eisenhower and de Gaulle and Adenauer back from the dead to participate in our discussion today, what would surprise them would not be the terminal crisis of the Atlantic Alliance, but rather the fact that it had held together for 76 years. They would find that remarkable. This is a truly exceptional era in world politics. So two structural problems bedeviled NATO from the beginning. We can call them burden sharing and what experts have long referred to as NATO's strategic dilemma. The United States has consistently spent more on defense per capita and per unit of GDP than most NATO members. As Europe has grown more prosperous, as European states have expanded their welfare states, and as life expectancy has grown longer in Europe than in the United States, this discrepancy has become more evident. However, so long as the alliance remained functional, it was just unrealistic to expect Europeans to spend as much on defense as Americans. Europeans were simply never in a position to project military force as decisively as Americans. With the exceptions of Britain and France, our NATO allies have all been non-nuclear powers. NATO's contingency plans for fighting a major war with Russia always assumed that nuclear weapons would be decisive. Why spend a lot of money developing conventional weapons if you assume that nuclear weapons are the key to deterrence? Even the two nuclear powers in Europe, Britain and France, built out very small nuclear forces. They were designed to deter an adversary from attacking their home soil with nuclear weapons, but not to deter an eventual adversary from invading or attacking third countries. European security always depended on the American nuclear deterrent. The problem, however, is that the American nuclear deterrent involved convincing an adversary that the United States would use nuclear weapons first in order to deter an aggressor from seizing the territory of its European allies. Would the United States use nuclear weapons to defend Hamburg if that meant putting Chicago at risk of nuclear retaliation? This was what experts referred to as NATO's security dilemma. The expansion of NATO eastward since the collapse of the Soviet Union means that today the question is whether the United States would use nuclear weapons to defend Tallinn or Riga if it means putting Chicago at risk of nuclear retaliation. As the historian Mark Trachtenberg has taught us in his magisterial study, A Constructed Peace, if any of you are interested in reading a good history of the Cold War, check this out. It's in the notes to my paper, which are online. I didn't send you by email. You can find the reference. This is really the best book, right, about the history of the Cold War. In his book, he tells us that John Kennedy is an American leader who decided to extend more or less permanently a nuclear umbrella over Western Europe, despite the misgivings of Eisenhower, his predecessor in the Oval Office, and de Gaulle and Adenauer, his European partners. The reason he did this was because he became convinced that he needed to ensure that Germany did not become a nuclear power. The Soviets had let him know in no uncertain terms that the acquisition of nuclear weapons by Germany could become a casus belli for them. They might be willing to go to war over that, over West Germany becoming a nuclear power. Kennedy understood why the Soviets were concerned about a nuclear Germany. He understood also that the prospect didn't exactly cause joy in France or Britain either. However, if Germany remained non-nuclear, Kennedy concluded that it would be secure only if the United States maintained military forces on German soil and extended its nuclear umbrella, that is, committed to using nuclear weapons to defend Germany for the foreseeable future. In East Asia, a similar situation developed. Russia and China and North Korea could only be deterred from invading Japan and South Korea and Taiwan if they feel that doing so might provoke American retaliation with nuclear weapons. In exchange for its American allies remaining non-nuclear, the Soviets and the Chinese passively accepted the continued presence of American troops on South Korean and Japanese soil and America's friendly relationship with Taiwan. If you read Trachtenberg, it becomes clear that the non-nuclear status of Germany and Japan over the past 75 odd years wasn't an inevitability. It flowed out of the military defeat of these two powers in World War II. Adenauer became convinced by the late 1950s that sooner or later Germany would have to become a nuclear power, because sooner or later NATO's strategic dilemma would cause the US nuclear umbrella to lose credibility. American officials and their German allies forced him to step down as chancellor in 1963 because of this. Ludwig Erhard, his successor in the German chancellor's office between 1963 and 66, was more accommodating to Kennedy and to the United States, but he too was reluctant to put definitive undertakings renouncing German acquisition of nuclear weapons. However, over time, Germany and Japan began to perceive advantages in non-nuclear status. Their status as advanced industrial economies and leading export nations gave them considerable influence in international relations, even without nuclear weapons. The nuclear taboo, that is, the strong feeling that use of nuclear weapons would be immoral and ought to be avoided at all costs, about which Nina Tannenwald has written eloquently, and that reference you can find in the written version of the paper too. Made renunciation of them appear forward thinking rather than reliability. Without the positive examples of Germany and Japan, it's difficult to imagine that South Africa would have abandoned its nuclear program when it transformed from being led by a white minority apartheid regime to accepting black majority rule in the 1990s. The group of nuclear nations has expanded since the 1960s, with Israel and Pakistan and India and North Korea now acknowledged to have nuclear weapons, and Iran having an advanced nuclear program. But proliferation has proceeded at a modest pace. Francis J. Gavin, who has written two important books about the history of nuclear proliferation, has made it clear that American policymakers in the 1960s and 70s anticipated a far more rapid pace of nuclear proliferation. If you could bring, the members of Kennedy's National Security Council back to life, right? They're all dead now too. Unfortunately, I knew some in my day. That the nuclear club is small as it still is, right? In 2025. All of this is going to change if the American nuclear umbrella closes. The Germans are already having conversations about becoming a nuclear power. The tiny nuclear forces maintained by France and Britain, in any case, won't be sufficient to deter Russia from expanding its influence further into what it calls its near abroad. There is even serious talk in the security community right now about Poland becoming a nuclear power. Certainly, Poland has a clear and present need to deter Russia. And of course, Japan and South Korea will have to acquire nuclear weapons too. Taiwan will obviously see the value of having them, but also the danger that launching a nuclear program would give the People's Republic of China the excuse it needs to invade the island before that program advances very far. One imagines that the process of nuclear proliferation won't end there. Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines will want them, obviously also Saudi Arabia. If Trump continues to use the British language he's using now about the Americas, Mexico, Canada, Brazil, Argentina, and Chile will want them too, and that's not the end of the story. There has long been a debate among nuclear strategists about whether the logic of deterrence continues to hold as the set of nuclear powers grows. The optimists feel that the logic of mutually assured destruction persists. The pessimists feel that the possibility of misperception, misunderstanding, and miscalculation, or downright irrationality expands as the group of people with their fingers on the nuclear button expands. As I noted, Francis Gavin concluded that the United States government has devoted considerable energy to continue proliferation over the past 65 years or so, even though it never defended this goal openly in policy briefs. But I'm getting ahead of myself a bit here. The first consequence of Trump distancing himself from the NATO alliance is likely to manifest itself in the Ukraine war. Russia is obviously having a hard time in Ukraine. Some Westerners estimate that it has taken over 1 million casualties in the war between, dead and seriously wounded soldiers. It's not for nothing that North Koreans are now deploying and suffering immense casualties on the front lines. The challenges to the Russian economy are also substantial. Experts don't discount the possibility of a collapse of Russian morale. But Ukraine is much the smaller of the two belligerents, and despite the extraordinary resolve, bravery, and ingenuity that Ukrainians have demonstrated, waging a war against a much larger aggressor, and despite the fact that the experts estimate that the Russians are taking 2 casualties to every one they inflict on the Ukrainians, there are limits to how long the Ukrainians can sustain the struggle. In particular, if American aid is either curtailed or ended, we have to allow for the possibility, if not inevitability, of a Ukrainian collapse. A Russian reoccupation of the entire Ukraine would be devastating. I mean, you've seen what they've been doing in the parts of the Ukraine that they've already occupied, right? The savagery of the Russian repression of Ukrainian nationalism will catapult us into a new moral universe. I cannot see clearly into the future of that new moral universe. I mean, imagine what the world's going to be like if the Russians occupy all of Ukraine and start liquidating every trace of Ukrainian nationalism there. Russia won't stop in Ukraine. Moldova will be on the agenda after that, and then the 3 Baltic states. There's always the possibility that the collapse of Ukraine could concentrate minds in Washington and lead to a reconsideration of the value of NATO. That's one reason why trying to peer too far into the future simply becomes an idle exercise. Russia will exit the Ukrainian war drastically weakened in any case. It may need some time to ready its next aggression. The questions are how much time and how formidable will any future adversaries appear. There's a possibility that Europe or a part of Europe will come together to contain Russia in the Baltic region. even in the event of a definitive American withdrawal from European security politics. When their security is fundamentally threatened, states can go to great lengths to fight for their survival. Will Germany seek to rally the EU to stand up to Putin? Will it make an important contribution to replacing the American nuclear umbrella, assuming it has closed? Will the states of the region, not just the three Baltic states, but also Finland and Sweden and Poland and Germany, show sufficient resolve to deter the Russians? Time will tell. I see through the glass very darkly today. As I've read through the literature preparing this talk, I've noticed that most observers are struck by the disarray in European politics at the moment. The right-wing Alternative for Deutschland is on the march in Germany, the National Rally in France. The eclipse of the Conservatives in Britain in the last elections may just be the prelude to the emergence of Nigel Farage's Reform UK as the hegemonic party on the right in that country. All of these formations have ties to Putin and Russia. Will the right surge to power across Europe and reach an accommodation with Putin? I'm afraid that my crystal ball doesn't have sufficient range to shed much light on these developments. It's going to be interesting for sure. We have to reckon with the possibility that the collapse of Ukraine could be followed, perhaps quickly, by the Chinese invasion of Taiwan. The Chinese military has just been a major exercise practicing the initial phases of such an invasion. The Chinese may well view their window of opportunity to retake Taiwan or to take Taiwan to be open about as wide as it's ever going to get following a Ukrainian collapse. I expect that the Trump administration will acquiesce to the Chinese invasion of Taiwan. I assume it is anticipating both the collapse of Ukraine and the invasion of Taiwan right now. I assume also that the Trump administration will withdraw American troops from South Korea and Japan and leave those two nations to their own devices. However, I take note of the anecdote that John Bolton has told reporters about his exchanges with Trump when he served as National Security Advisor in Trump's first term during 2018-2019. When the question of Taiwan and China came up in conversation in the Oval Office, according to Bolton, Trump would point at the head of the Sharpie gun that he invariably held in his hand and say, "This is Taiwan." And then he would gesture at the Lindbergh desk and continue, "This is China." There are reports that Elon Musk is liquidating all supply chains linking SpaceX to Taiwan. Given Musk's proximity to the president, at least at the moment, this scarcely inspires confidence in the administration's commitment to Taiwanese self-determination. What happens then? Perhaps Trump invades Greenland and Panama and annexes Canada. His public statements about our neighbors appear nonsensical in the moral universe in which we have been moving up to now, but they would become more intelligible in a world in which Russia has liquidated Ukraine, China has conquered Taiwan, and the American nuclear umbrella has been folded. We may find ourselves in a world similar to the one that George Orwell predicted in his novel 1984. In it, three great powers dominated the world: Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia. In their internal structures, they came to resemble one another. All three were totalitarian states. Let me conclude by restating that it's impossible to foresee the future. I certainly can't foresee the future, and I make no claim to be able to. I suspect that we're living in a time of vast and rapid change. Drastic events call into being drastic counter-reactions, which are impossible to anticipate. At the dawn of the Atlantic Alliance in August 1950, the Secretary of State Dean Acheson made a series of notes to himself as part of his preparation for testimony to the U.S. Senate Committee on Appropriations about the Mutual Defense Assistance Program, which is not bigger European countries, right? In that he tried to make sense of the novel situation in which he and his colleagues found themselves. He was about 8 weeks into the Korean War at the time, and you may recall that the Korean War wasn't going very well. From an American perspective, 8 weeks out. He wrote, quote, "We are in the position of the individual officers who spy on the death front. Here's in a new way the roaring of the cataract." At any rate, and make no mistake about it, we are now exposed without opportunity for time to teach us or shield us to blows of fate. Atkinson was reimagining his place in an international system in which the two oceans separating the United States from the Eastern Hemisphere not appeared to insulated from security threats originating far away. Donald Trump wants to return to a world in which the protection once afforded by those oceans somehow is restored. That aspiration is illusory, but the consequences of his policies will be real enough. Now, I assume that the cataract to which Atkinson refers in his notes, right, the roaring of the cataract, that it bears some similarity to the Niagara River above Niagara Falls. The easy part is spotting the vessel as the current seizes it. The impossible part is predicting how the vessel and its occupants reach the bottom of the escarpment. I can hear the roaring of the cataract, but everything beyond that is highly conjectural. That's that's the best I can give you right now. You know,
First, I'd like to apologize for having interrupted you. Good Lord, not that I disagree at all, but the outcome of Trump as president, as you outlined, is extremely negative. I have a question. I'm old and stuck in the past, I guess. This is the question. I have heard Hungary referred to as Putin's ally in NATO. To what extent do you think that is true? And if it is not true, is it conceivable that a strategy in Russia would be to develop a mole in NATO or now?
yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's probably a little bit of an exaggeration. No, I mean, certainly Orban's regime has ties, friendly ties to the Russians, right? But allied is maybe not, I'm not privy, to the confidential discussions that take place between Orban and Putin. I mean, we've seen Obama kind of drag his heels in NATO business, for instance. Now he was the last country to agree to the Swedes joining the alliance, for instance. Now, will Putin look for interlocutors in NATO? Absolutely, right? Especially, and I think the Americans' withdrawal. Of course, the Russians are going to try to turn Germany into a satellite state, right? Will there be people in Russia, in Germany, that are prepared to reach a far going combination with Russia? I think there will. I mean, certainly that all the way up to this. On the right wing in terms of political spectrum, people are going to be considering with favor a far reaching from with Russia. Yeah.
Since 2000, the United States has attacked Lebanon, excuse me, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. Right now, we're helping Israel massacre Palestinians. How many times or how many countries has Russia invaded since the year 2000?
Well, let's see. The Russians have they've got people in Georgia, or at least they're supporting separatists in Georgia. They've got proxy forces in Moldavia. They've got their forces in Ukraine. They have had, extensive bases in Syria where they're propping up the Assad regime, although they seem to be evacuating them now, not completely, but they've evacuated a lot of their forces from Syria. They have a presence in quite a few countries in the Sahel and in Africa, and they've been ejecting the French, right, from places like Mali. When the Russians present themselves in the Sahel, the attractive part of an alliance between the government and the Russians who don't care how aggressive you are, right? If you cooperate with us, we'll turn a blind eye to that, right? And there's also people who are running countries oppressively in the Sahel and we're going through deals with them. Is that enough for you? You need more?
Also, in how many countries, in those five countries, how many bases does the United States have compared to Russia? Yeah, military bases and all.
There's a lot more bases. The United States has a lot more bases. It's hard to find a precedent in history of a country that has bases in so many different places. And of course, my talk has been in part about that extension of American power and the system of alliances. It was driven in part by the feeling of many of our partners that the United States would provide them security.
Is Russia still involved in Cuba?
Not too much, I guess. Yeah. I'm sure they still have a friendly relationship with the government there, but yeah.
If you had to crawl into the mind of Putin, for all of us, it is it's totally irrational. That anybody, the Russians are worse off for it. There's nothing to be gained by doing what they're doing. What is the, at least that's my perception sitting in Bowling Green, Ohio. Why is this happening?
So I think Putin thought this was going to be a good war in Ukraine. He thought it's going to be over in 3 or 4 days, right? The troops that deployed on the front closest to Kiev, to the capital of Ukraine, they had their dress uniforms packed for victory parade. He was wrong. And the thing is, so the front force will have a crystal ball, which we have either, that he would never have ordered this operation in the first place. But the question is, what happens once you get in? And I think that Putin has made the calculation that if he ever had made a mistake by invading Ukraine, that his political future would be over. And perhaps more than his political future would be at stake, right? His likelihood of dying in bed, natural causes in old age, might decline too, fairly drastically. And so, he made a mistake, but now the only way he can figure out to recover is by winning. And there's never been much indication that he's interested in a negotiated settlement here.
But what your conversation is that if he comes through on Ukraine, then he's going to keep on going.
Yes.
But he already got his nose bloody tremendously, and it's like, get out, count your blessings and settle with Ukraine. What's your thoughts?
Well, my thought is that, this has been enormously costly. But if NATO falls apart, if the United States withdraws its nuclear umbrella from Europe, if it takes its troops home, the logic of expanding further into the near abroad changes, doesn't it?
And what happens if Putin's gone? Is this Russia's war or is this Putin's war? Are the Russian people going to continue? I'm going to be going eventually. We all are. We know that.
Very good point. Things can change drastically with change of leadership.
Repeat the question so everybody.
So the question was, what happens when Putin is gone? Could that change the situation? And I'm just agreeing it could change the situation.
Where's Turkey factor? Is it Turkey a reliable member of NATO or not? I think it's very, seems like they got a pretty positive influence in Ukraine, here down across the water.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Are they reliable? Who's reliable at this point? Certainly they don't have interests that align 100% with those in Russia, right? We can see that. I mean, the Turks are carving out their own sphere of influence in former Soviet Central Asia, right? Turkey is taken more seriously in Azerbaijan than even Russia is. I think it's fair to say. Um, and they're, you know, play their hand cautiously with respect to the war in Ukraine, right? Um, uh, they've been trying to obtain some help to the Ukrainians in some respects, right? In getting supplies through, but they've been careful not to, they don't want to, like a confrontation with the Russians. I'd say it's a little bit complicated.
I mean, it's so much of the conflicts with what I'm understanding it. And I mean, at the end of World War II, and a lot of us, I didn't fly, but people weren't happy when the UN started with international rules to follow so that we wouldn't have another war. And I had the impression as a kid in the 40s and 50s that the United States joined the UN because afraid somebody else would do to us with an atomic bomb what we did in Japan. It's like whatever it was going. And NATO, if I understand correctly, started as a defense thing for the United against the USSR. So if that was the case, why wouldn't the NATO automatically disband when there was no longer the USSR? I remember in, it was probably the 2012, eventually into the campaign, I was living in Ireland, we got paid attention. Right. First in the nation and all that, election season was forever. But I can remember that the Republican candidate or half what were the worst concern was he said Russia. And it's like all the Democrats it's like and Hillary follows it. In fact, that was just silly that the Cold War been over for 20 years. And people who maybe know, like Reagan, who was in CIA, and was I know Reagan, the presidential booster and the whole, and Jeffrey Sachs, who helped work with some of those countries that were former Soviet countries with their economies, so had both said that after the break of the US, that Russia wanted to join and they were rejected. And that
Ruth, sorry, but what is your question?
it's not nothing good. And you yeah, you should have some influence. And Jim Britain and he said don't like
All right, Ruth, we'll have to move on. I'm sorry.
So it seems like after the war and
Ruth, you can discuss this after, but we're on a time limit, so we'll just have to get to the next question.
Well,
Sorry.
Let me try to answer it.
Okay.
There are still countries in Europe that perceive Russia to be a security threat. That's what we was I think. Well, in Europe, hadn't perceived Russia to be a security threat. It's hard to imagine it was, but it was there until now. By the way, about the purposes of NATO, you might remember Lord Eyman was a British diplomat who was the first general secretary of the Allied, and he is alleged to have once said that the purpose of NATO was to keep the Americans in the Russian out and the German down. And this gets repeated all the time. I'm sure some of you have heard this before too. But it sort of indicates that there are three things going on here. Europeans, after the experience of World War I and then the interwar years, Europeans were very interested in some kind of enduring alliance with the United States. They wanted Europe to be involved in European security affairs, right? Russian Europeans did. people worried about Germany, they're worried about German resurgence and international alliance that contained Germany somehow looked attractive too. And then there was a pursuit for from two directions.
Can you talk about the world food situation with regard to the Ukraine war?
Yeah, so I guess we haven't really had a catastrophe, right? At times it looked like it, right? When the Russians were trying to interdict Ukrainian grain shipments through the Black Sea. I mean, it's a little bit of a dangerous situation. There's always a problem with food security in the world, right? And food prices. That's not at the top of my worry list right now. Is it at the top of yours?
It's just another consideration added to all other considerations involved with the Ukraine.
It obviously is a consideration. Yeah.
Another aspect of it, if Trump does cut a deal with Putin, and Putin can keep what he wants, does that mean Ukraine just is a failed state because of the economics, all of everything that's really worth any money or any, if Ukraine would be gone, then it'd be a farmland?
I guess I just don't know. I mean, the idea of the Russians just rolling over Ukraine and trying to reincorporate it into Russia seems horrifying to me. You know, I mean, the amount of repression that would be involved, just given what the Russians have done, right? And lost in parts of Ukraine that they've already occupied. But we have to allow for that possibility, don't we?
Well, I guess my question is, or my thought is, if Russia gets the most productive, valuable part of Ukraine, wouldn't it mean that a matter of time before people, the remainder of Ukraine become so, I don't know,
There's been speculation in the West about something in the deals and a ceasefire, right? To allow the Russians to occupy some of the territory they've already taken. Putin has never said he's interested in something like that. He's always wanted everything. And we speculate a lot about what would happen if there were a ceasefire, right? But I don't see an inclination on the part of Russia to accept the ceasefire.
It's my understanding that they actually did plan to end the war, said a couple months after it started, and that the United States said no to Zelensky. They cannot stop. And if the United States is surrounded by if the United States is surrounded by enemy states, what will we do? We would fight to survive. Russia is terrified of being surrounded by NATO states. And so what do we expect them to do? To simply go away? The fact is that the United States has a vested monetary interest in keeping conflagrations going. $100 billion a year we bring in from war. I think that's what's behind it.
So
And also, we hear a new thing from our government because we're murdering Palestinians. We have Israel. What Netanyahu has done to Palestinians is far worse than what Putin is doing to Ukrainians.
well, I think so you think the Russians are innocent and the Americans are responsible for everything?
I think Russia is terrified of being surrounded by NATO.
They're not surrounded.
Can you speak to that? I have heard that the latter countries accepted into NATO did alarm. We're not fleeing.
You know, have a discussion about the word expense, right? And there are people like John Rosenberg, Chicago, or the NATO's expansion east has destabilized the region. Look, the thing is, at the end of the Cold War, we have a nuclear alliance, we have a truncated Russia, and we have its territories sort of in the middle, right? Those newly independent nations or nations which have been satellites to Russia are regain some autonomy in foreign affairs. So they look to NATO for security. They fear Russian revival and Russian expansionism. And NATO expands. The question is, what's left those countries then, like without security alliances, would we have a more stable world? I mean, Ukraine is an example of a country who doesn't have a security alliance with anybody, right? Oh, wait, in 1994, the Russians signed a treaty. And another question that was what happens to Soviet nuclear weapons deployed on the soil of newly independent Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine, right? These three former Soviet republics that suddenly have become independent nations. And the US and Britain and the Soviets got together and we put together this Budapest memorandum whereby these countries decided to embrace non-nuclear status. The nuclear weapons on their soil were retired by the Russians, right? The Russians took them back and put them on Russian soil. And the Russians signed a solemn treaty agreeing to respect the sovereignty of these three countries, right? Which were accepting non-nuclear status, right? And this is one of the treaties that Putin tore up when he invaded Ukraine. Mhm.
Assuming that the United States Armed Forces in Europe are not subsidized by countries in which they are currently deployed.
Well, to some extent they are, right? I mean, there are obviously treaties in effect with South Korea and Germany, whereby these countries um, uh, uh, provide some of the expenses, right? And so some limitation of American troops there. What I said in my talk was, I said, look, for the most part, the United States has spent more on defense than its partners have, right, as a percentage of GDP or per capita. Maybe not in every case, right? I mean, there might have been some years in which the French were all fighting their colonial wars in the 1950s, in which they were actually spending more, but for the most part. And I just made the argument that it's really hard to get excited about spending a lot on your military if you know your military is inferior to your allies' military. It's sort of structurally going to remain that way. But yeah, I mean the Germans have paid for part of it, paying in part for the American military presence on their soil. So the South Koreans, they'll pay rather handsomely.
Another scenario that we're fearing is that if the United States isolates itself, well, I mean, we're assuming that NATO will fail the remaining nations. They might not.
That's true. And we'll have to see, won't we? And the Russian or the Europeans are going to have compelling reasons to bolster their security stance at that point, aren't they?
Well, hopefully we would only isolate for 4 years. So if we did, and we might beg to be back in.
Well, they want it back.
Well, they'll want us back, but
Yeah, you're right.
we'll have to beg to get back in. The point is, we're assuming that without us, NATO is going to fail.
And I don't think my talk assumed that. I had a rec in there where I suggested that Europe might rally. I think that's possible. Things look kind of bad right now, look at how divided European politics are now. In almost every country, there's almost the same level of polarization in Germany and France, and Britain as there is in the United States, right? And we have these new right-wing formations in all of these countries who seem to be very Putin friendly. You know, it looks kind of delicate, but you're right. I mean, it's hard to tell. And when dramatic things happen in the world, it creates reactions, right? We shouldn't discount the possibility that the Europeans could take the initiative and defend themselves. I think we have a reason for maintaining something like NATO, even if the United States walks away. And by the way, Putin has been substantially weakened in this Ukraine war, right? He's not exactly the same kind of tiger right now that he was before this started.
Possibility though, because he's lost so much of his conventional strength, that the chance of them going nuclear is heightened.
Unfortunately, and he's been talking about. And one of the things he's been talking about is because you know, he hasn't done very well with conventional forces. And
What do you think, obviously, everything's hypothetical, but what do you think if the China and United States, with their economic powers, get together a little bit concerning Formosa or Thailand? Okay, you're kind of like Cuba to us, and let China actually take Taiwan. What do you think might happen there?
you know, it really, I don't know enough to make a strong case about what the U.S. policy in the states should be. I realized the defense of Taiwan was very problematic, right? If the President of the United States tomorrow, I think I would cancel all the other appointments and say I want a week to study the situation in East Asia and learn exactly, you know, what our options are there. I really don't know. I mean, one thing I can say is I hate to see the United States just walk away from Taiwan. I hate to see the United States walk away from Korea and Japan, or South Korea and Japan. I don't think that's necessary right now. But we already have to manage this relationship with China, right? China has half of world manufacturing capacity right now. And it would be nice to have a constructive relationship with China somehow. And it looks like a very difficult problem. It's not as if this was going to be easy if Joe Biden or if Kamala Harris won the elections, right, last fall. We'd still have a lot of challenges in putting together an East Asian policy. But I'm not going to. You're asking me to just to indulge in speculating about giving Taiwan to China. I'm not going to do that.
Didn't we always recognize that turning off this China's?
Well, that's true. I mean, our position all along has been that
I see, I don't understand why you changed or whatever, why we started to get your view. Did China do something to our stricter? We're, you know, we said we recognize that. So I don't know what's happened.
Yeah, the United States position has never been that Taiwan's independent country. The position has always been that it's part of China and different governments on the mainland and in Taiwan, right? And the United States has always had the hope that these differences would be resolved, right? I mean,
Since both parties, yeah, campaigns get money from the people who and tired and leader. But it might be that they have a reason to make us fear people around the world.
Let me ask you a question. Was your heart warmed when the Chinese crushed the democratic movement in Hong Kong?
No.
Did that please you?
I like democracy, so I think democracy where we do what we're supposed to, and so they emulate it and try to follow it. I don't like democracy, where the CIA working in a democratically elected government in Iran in 1963 or something. In 4 days, it's like, and leading to the hostage crisis. And it's like, I don't like, so what we do we pretend it in the Americas. We have overturned governments and solved things. Excuse me, I was having to look at the history. There are only two valid reasons to go to war. One, if you're attacked. Two, if a weaker country is attacked unfairly. Does anybody remember Tibet? What did the Chinese do there? Tibet, gone. What are they going to do in Taiwan? They're going to repress and it's going to be Hong Kong all over again. Of course. We have a responsibility to defend the weak.
Well, I don't know about that.
I'll take this in a different direction to see if you even bite on it. I don't know if you will. I'm not asking you to bite on it. But
Doing pretty well about not saying utterly foolish things.
conversation that's happening, we'll hope in Europe with Russia, whatever it might be. And you want to comment on social media and how communication today has changed the dynamics of when we were younger, I'm talking for all of us, didn't happen. We had Walter Cronkite was talking to us and we knew what Walter Cronkite was talking about. So you want to touch on that?
Not really. I mean, obviously the media environment has changed, and obviously it's had consequences. But I don't know. I don't know if I can give you any insights here today that are really worthwhile.
I don't think Walter Cronkite actually knew what he was talking about. Back in the late 50s, early 60s, there was a big to-do about Laos. And everybody's hair was on fire about what was going to happen in that country. And we were talking millions and millions and millions of dollars at their military. And we didn't even have anybody in that country who knew how to speak Lao. And it just seems to me that back at that time, what you were being told a lot of times was just made up. And that's all there's just a comment. I don't know if there's a question.
Yeah, it's probably true. Disinformation is not completely new.
When we look back at the history of Russia, there's always been, at least I was always told that part of the reason for the Soviet plot was the Russia to not before the American war. And the question back to you is Putin trying to reestablish that quote unquote protection, so to speak? Or how much of it is Putin just as other ideas?
Well, yeah, I guess I don't want to say that Russia doesn't have any security concerns here. I'm sure they do. I guess what I will say is I don't think Charles Mearsheimer is right, and he wants to assign 90% of the blame for the conflict in Ukraine right now on the United States and NATO expansion, right? And I think NATO expansion was kind of inevitable. You have these countries that have been Russian satellites, Soviet satellites, they've been Russian Soviet republics, they're afraid of Russia still, they're looking for security. You've got two choices, right? One is you can try to incorporate them into the Atlantic Alliance, and the other is you can leave them twisting in the wind. it doesn't seem to me that leaving them twisting in the wind was that great of a choice. Some of the countries that were twisting the wind in Georgia, you know, and Moldavia and Ukraine, and we've seen what's happened in all three.
Well, from what I understand, I can't remember the details, but the people that I got was that there were reasons for that too, that were aggressive on the side of the West. But I understood that the United Nations Charter, the countries that signed on was to get world peace. And this was pretty much what NATO does for certain blocks. But doesn't a country that doesn't have a big military, doesn't have an alliance, like say Finland before they joined NATO? I mean, they were neutral, I mean, they're not Russia and whatever. I don't think the Finns felt in danger. And didn't the UN Charter protect them? If Russia had been the rest of the world supposed to, according to the UN, attack the aggressor, that was what was supposed to happen.
So what is your explanation for why Finland joined NATO?
Well, because of all this connection, from what I understand from not just Mersheimer, but from Raymond Governor, who, like I said, advised two presidents during the Cold War about Russia. That's what he studied. I mean, you probably still pay attention to those people in the CIA and Sachs, Jeffrey Sachs, who actually, and he's an economist, and he looks at the total picture and what it is. And in 1990, there was an oral agreement when the Soviet Union agreed to the unification of Germany that they would not go east of
I've heard that story before.
which did not want
You know, the Russians actually got that on paper. Putting things on paper. And anybody can say they had an oral agreement afterwards, right?
Well, from my understanding, that's the reason for no roots in the tent of government, they didn't run. So, what did I tell?
It was back 1994, Budapest new memorandum, the one that Putin tore up. Right, that was on paper.
When we look from the government, which is supported in the United States, it's like I need to look at the whole.
I don't think they go any further than this, but I will point out to you that if Finland was splendidly protected by the United Nations, it's interesting that it decided to join NATO, right? A couple of years ago.
Well, the UN has failed in other ways.
Yeah.
There's what, the end of near the end of World War II, I can't think of the name of the agreement, it was a meeting of a lot of the allies in New Jersey, I believe it was. They set up in the valley.
It's in Hampshire, Bretton Woods.
Brett, thank you. What that agreement is slowly falling apart. And you have the NATO, how much of that is all intertwined into each other, or is it just things that happen on their own separate?
Well, I mean, I think these things were all related. Yeah, Bretton Woods has been falling apart for some time, right? So we had this regime in which barriers to trade were still right? And as we know, that's kind of outlined completely. Right?
There's no free order in the world because it gave a lot of the World War II countries who have been devastated by the war a chance to rebuild their economies.
Creating order in the world and slapping tariffs on your allies and changing it from day to day creates disorder. And we're going to see a lot of that disorder apparently.
Well, you know, the Russian troops that are in that little segment of Moldavia, surrounded by Ukraine and all these other NATO allies.
How are they even resupplying them, right? Oh. Defected by now. Yeah, I'm not sure, but people, obviously, people don't want to provoke the Russian bear too far, but I'm not, I'm playing with details of that, it's not a question. Shall we call it a morning?
Yeah.